The door opened by itself. And if you've ever lived in a quiet old American town, tucked between autumn fields and roads that don't bother with street lights, you'll know that a door opening on its own is never just a draft. Never just a cricket is a memory trying to breathe again. Good evening, my friend. This is Evelyn Blackwood, speaking softly to you from Midnight Murmurs Radio, where every whisper carries a story, and every story helps you drift a little deeper into rest. Before we wander into tonight's tale, before we visit the house where the door would not stay shut, let's make sure you are comfortable. Gently settle into your bed. Let your shoulders sink down. Loosen your jaw. Soften your breath. Inhale, slow, and exhale even slower. Close your eyes if you wish. Allow the weight of the day to slip away like snow melting from an old wooden fence. This is your quiet hour, your safe place, your moment to drift into the warm hush of imagination. Tonight's story begins in Thornwood, a town few people notice anymore. The map still lists it, but only because no one has bothered to cross it out. The town moves at the pace of falling leaves. The diner closes whenever the cook gets sleepy. And the library's lights flicker not from ghosts, but from wiring never updated since the 1950s. Or so people say. Just beyond the center of Thornwood stands a pale blue house with slanted gutters, a porch too big for its foundation, and a single brass door that never quite latched right. The locals call it the Harper House, though no Harper has lived there since the late 1800s. It isn't famous, or feared, or even particularly interesting except for the door. That front door opens. Not when it's windy. Not when someone pulls it. Not even when someone forgets to lock it. It opens by itself. That is where our narrator for tonight enters the story, Louisa Cotton, a traveling archivist who visited Thornwood each autumn to collect records from rural towns. Louisa preferred quiet places, towns, where history felt like it could still be touched with bare hands. Thornwood suited her perfectly. Every year she stayed at the same bed and breakfast, drank the same cinnamon coffee, and walked past the Harper House on her way to the old courthouse. And every year she saw the same thing, the door, standing open, just a crack no more than the width of a single finger. No one claimed it, no one fixed it, and no one explained it. On the fourth night of her visit, after spending the evening sorting yellowed census logs and faded hunting permits, Louisa decided to pass by the Harper House again. Thornwood was wrapped in its usual autumn stillness. The hum of distant crickets, the wooden groan of the empty lumber yard, the far-off clatter of a freight train rolling through black fields. When she reached the house, she paused. The door was closed. Completely, firmly, as if it had never moved in its life. She stood there in the orange glow of the lone street lamp, watching the shadows shift on the porch. Something about the stillness felt too heavy, as if the air were waiting, and then slowly, soundlessly, the door opened. A soft breath of cool air brushed her face, like someone sighing in relief on the other side. Louisa didn't run. Curiosity lived inside her like a second heartbeat, and though she felt a prickle rise along her arms, she stepped forward. She had spent her life studying forgotten stories, and now it seemed one had chosen her. Inside the doorway, the darkness was warm, almost hinted. She could hear what sounded like the faintest rustle paper, maybe paper shifting somewhere deep in the house, as though the past was rearranging itself. The townsfolk always said the Harper house was empty, but Louisa, standing there with her breath slowing again, realized something comforting in the oddest way. Empty places are never truly empty, not in a town where history has nowhere to go. As she reached out a hand toward the open doorway, the house exhaled again, long and tired, like someone finally ready to speak. Tonight, she would step inside, and the story long forgotten would begin to wake. For now, my friend, let the edges of this scene soften. Allow the darkness of the old house to become a blanket in your mind. Let your breath fall into a slow, steady rhythm. Louisa hesitated at the threshold only for a breath, feeling the cool air roll out from the darkness like a slow tide drifting across her shoes. The door, still open of its own accord, seemed almost patient, as though it had been waiting decades for someone willing to listen. She stepped inside, her fingers brushing the frame, and the wooden floor accepted her weight with a single soft groan that echoed deeper into the house. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, the scent of attics that had held on to secrets too long. Moonlight filtered through a thin curtain in the front room, illuminating dust like drifting snowflakes caught mid-fall. Louisa felt something settle around her, not a presence, exactly, but a quiet awareness, like the house was adjusting to the shape of her breathing. She whispered hello, unsure why she did, and the room responded only with the far-off rustle she had heard from outside. It came from deeper within, somewhere near the back where the hallway narrowed into shadow. Her footsteps stayed soft, as though the house demanded politeness, and she found herself obeying without question. The wallpaper, once patterned with blue flowers, had faded into ghostly outlines, as if the blooms had slipped away over time. She reached out to trace them, but before her hand touched the wall, a cold thread of air curled around her wrist, guiding her gently forward. It wasn't frightening, more like being nudged by someone too polite to speak. Louisa's breath matched the steady hush of the house as she followed the current through the narrow hall. A portrait hung crooked on the wall. A woman in a dark dress, her expression unreadable, her eyes slightly too focused for a simple painting. Louisa slowed, tilting her head, but the air behind her pressed forward, encouraging her to continue. Wait a step. She felt the weight of silence pressing closer, thick but not hostile, as though the house was remembering how to speak after years of stillness. She stopped at a doorway near the end of the hall where the temperature dipped sharply, the breath leaving her lungs in a pale wisp. The door, an interior one this time, was shut tight. Unlike the front door, its brass knob gleamed faintly as if touched recently. She reached out. The instant her fingers brushed the metal, the same gentle draft swept along her arm, and the knob turned under her hand. The door eased open, slow and deliberate. Inside was a study, small and neat despite the dust, with stacks of old letters tied in twine resting on a desk. A single chair sat pulled slightly away, as though someone had just stood up from it. Louisa stepped closer, her heart beating with a steady, curious rhythm. The letters looked carefully arranged, intentional, waiting. When she lifted the top bundle, the air thickened around her, not oppressive but expectant. She loosened the twine, unfolded the first page, and read the date, October 17th, 1893. The ink, though faded, was unmistakably real. And as she began reading the first lines, "If the door opens again tonight, I will take it as a sign that the house remembers me," the lights in the hallway flickered. Not violently. Just once, as if acknowledging the words. Louisa continued reading, her voice barely above a whisper, her breath sinking with the slow thrum of the old house. The letter spoke of footsteps in the hall when no one lived there, of quiet knocks behind walls, of objects moved to places they did not belong. But the tone was not fearful. It was longing, almost affectionate, as though the writer believed the house itself was alive with memory, trying to hold on to the last pieces of a life that had slipped away. As Louisa reached the final sentence, "I am not afraid of a home that won't forget me," the door behind her creaked softly. She turned, expecting the draft again, but instead saw the faint outline of a figure, no more solid than the dust drifting through moonlight, lingering in the doorway. It didn't move. It didn't threaten. It simply watched, patient as the open door had been, as though it wanted her to finish the story it could not speak. Louisa set the letter down gently, her pulse steady and strangely calm. Whatever lived in this house memory, spirit, or something woven from birth, did not want to frighten her. It wanted to be understood, and so she whispered into the dim room, "I'm listening." And the house, with a long, quiet sigh through its beams, seemed to answer. The moment Louisa whispered that she was listening, the house seemed to settle into a deeper quiet, as if the floorboards, the walls, even the drifting dust had exhaled in relief. She felt it not with her skin, but somewhere deeper, in that soft part of the mind that knows when it is being watched with gentle recognition instead of malice. The faint silhouette in the doorway did not move toward her or away. It merely lingered, its edges shimmering like heat rising from an old road. And as Louisa blinked, it dissolved into the air, as though it had never been there at all, leaving behind only the faint impression of presence. She turned back to the letters on the desk, drawn to them like someone finding a half-forgotten melody. The next one was dated a week later, still in October 1893. The handwriting trembled slightly more, the ink uneven, as if the writer had been cold or anxious, or both. Louisa read in silence, the words slipping into her mind like murmurs carried through a long corridor. Notes about footsteps pacing in the kitchen at dawn, a drawer opening by itself, a soft knock at the window when the wind was perfectly still. Yet each description was tinged with tenderness, not fear. "The house is trying," the writer said. "It remembers too much and too little all at once." A subtle warmth brushed Louisa's shoulder then, so light she almost mistook it for her imagination. She turned, expecting emptiness, but instead she heard a soft, rhythmic tapping like knuckles against old wood from somewhere beyond the hallway. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, patient, not urgent, almost as though inviting. Louisa placed the letters down carefully and stepped back into the hall. The air there felt thicker, carrying a faint scent of old pine and something distant, maybe rain-soaked earth. The tapping echoed again, guiding her toward a narrow stairwell she hadn't noticed before, tucked behind a small cabinet that seemed to have shifted slightly out of place. A draft curled down the stairs, cool but not unfriendly. Brushing her cheek as though nudging her upward, Louisa hesitated only a moment before climbing. Each step creaked softly under her weight, releasing long-held breaths of dust and memories. The higher she walked, the quieter the world below became, as though she were climbing not just through the house, but into its mind. At the top, she found a small landing with a single door, painted a shade of pale blue, now faded almost to gray. The tapping had stopped. The silence wrapped around her like a blanket worn thin from years of use. She reached for the knob. It was warm, unexpectedly so, like someone had held it only moments before. When she turned it, the door opened inward with a soft sigh, revealing a small attic room lit only by the silver wash of moonlight through a single round window. The room was sparse, an old trunk, a chair, a few scattered books, and on the floor a patch of dust disturbed by footprints that were not hers. They led across the room to the window, where they simply ended. Louisa stepped inside, her breath slow, steady, letting the house guide her attention the way a tide guides. Driftwood, her gaze fell to the trunk. Something inside it pressed faintly against the lid, as if stirred by her presence. She crouched and lifted it. The hinges groaned a soft protest, but opened. Inside lay a collection of small objects. A brass key, a child's wooden horse figurine, a folded piece of fabric that had once been bright red, and at the bottom, a leather-bound journal cracked along the spine. She reached for it. The attic held still, air tightening as though waiting. Louisa opened the journal to the first page. It wasn't dated. The handwriting was smaller, neater than the letters downstairs, and the words felt heavier, carrying something personal and unspoken. There is a door in this house that does not behave like other doors. It opens when it wishes to, and when it opens, it remembers. Louisa's pulse quickened not with fear, but with the sensation of being drawn deeper into something vast, old, and quietly aching. She could almost feel the house listening as she turned the page. More notes, scraps about sleepless nights, about faint humming from the walls, about glimpses of a woman walking down the hall that vanished before the writer could follow, and then a line that made the air in the attic shift sharply around her. If you hear the tapping, it means the house is choosing you. Louisa looked up. The tapping resumed closer now, just outside the attic door. Slow, measured, welcoming. She closed the journal gently and whispered, "I'm still listening." The tapping stopped, and the house seemed to breathe. The attic seemed to lean closer the moment Louisa whispered her quiet promise, its rafters settling with soft murmurs that echoed like distant breaths, as though the old house had been waiting years, decades for someone to answer. She stood still, letting the silence deepen, letting the tapping that had guided her fade into the wooden air around her. The round window cast a pale moonlit circle onto the floor, and within that circle, dust motes drifted like suspended memories, each glimmering as if reflecting pieces of forgotten lives. Louisa felt an inexplicable calm settling over her. the kind that seeped into the bones, slow and warm. She clutched the leather-bound journal gently, almost reverently, as she walked toward the window. The footprints leading there were faint but deliberate, as if someone had paused to stare out at the night decades ago, leaving their presence pressed into the floorboards. She followed their path and knelt beside the window, letting the cool light spill across her face. The view below revealed the quiet curve of the small town, its empty streets glowing faintly beneath lantern-style streetlights, their soft halos trembling in the breeze. Everything appeared peaceful, timeless, untouched by the worries that haunted the modern world. But Louisa sensed that thin veil between serenity and sorrow. The quiet always held a story beneath it. When she returned her attention to the journal, a new page caught her eye, one that had been bookmarked by a thin red ribbon frayed at the edges. She opened to the marked page, and the handwriting here was different, more hurried, the letters leaning forward as if running from something. The door opened again tonight. It read, "I didn't touch Italiano. I only look." And when I looked away, it closed on its own. Whoever lingers here. They are patient, but they are watching. A soft shift of wood sounded behind her, too gentle to be a threat, more like someone repositioning themselves in a chair. Louisa didn't startle. She had begun to understand the house's language the way it announced presence, not with fear, but with longing. She turned a few more pages, each one adding another brushstroke to the picture of whoever had once lived here and shared quiet nights with something unseen. The journal described the tapping that moved through the house in slow patterns, always consistent, always intentional, and never when guests were around. It mentioned shadows that leaned the wrong way under lamplight, voices that were not words but soft hums, and dreams that felt too vivid to belong only to sleep. Louisa read until her breath matched the steady rhythm of the night outside, until the words blurred slightly from the softness of her blinking. Then one entry stopped her short, only a sentence. "If the attic calls you, it means the house remembers your name." Louisa felt a slow, deep pull in her chest, quiet as the tide. She closed the journal, her fingers lingering on the worn leather. She didn't know whose name the house remembered, hers or someone else's, but she knew she was meant to be here in this moment, listening. A gentle creaking stirred the silence again, coming from the doorway she had just passed through. It wasn't tapping now. It was the sound of wood shifting, as though someone invisible had rested their hand on the frame. Louisa rose, holding the journal against her chest, and stepped toward the sound. The attic door, which she had left open only a few inches, now stood fully open. The hallway beyond it washed in a dim amber glow from an old wall sconce she hadn't noticed earlier. The light flickered once, twice, as if acknowledging her. Louisa moved through the doorway, the hush of the attic receding behind her like a slow closing curtain. The hallway felt different, now not darker, not colder, but more expectant, like air holding its breath. Her footsteps soft automatically, becoming part of the house's rhythm, blending into its age-old cadence. Halfway down the hall, she heard it again, the tapping, but this time it was softer, almost delicate, as if coming from the floor beneath her feet, traveling through the wood like a pulse. Tap, tap, tap. Louisa paused, letting the sound guide her attention downward. The hallway runner faded red with an intricate floral pattern, a slight lift near one corner. Then a as though something lay beneath it. She crouched carefully and lifted the fabric. Beneath it, she found a small brass ring embedded in the floorboard, a hidden latch, worn smooth by fingers long gone. The tapping ceased the moment she touched it, replaced by a warm stillness that settled over her like a hand laid gently on her shoulder. Louisa inhaled slowly, deeply, feeling the quiet thrum of the house around her. Then she curled her fingers around the ring and prepared to lift. As she did, she whispered into the dim air, "I'm still here," and the house, in its ancient, breath-like silence, seemed to whisper back. The latch lifted with a muted metallic sigh, as if relieved to finally be touched after so many silent years, and the floorboard loosened beneath Louisa's hand, rising just enough for her fingers to slip underneath. The wood felt warmer than she expected, carrying a faint pulse of heat that lingered like the memory of a hand that had rested there only moments before. As she slowly pulled the panel upward, the hallway lights trembled again, casting long, gentle shadows that wavered like breath. Beneath the floorboard lay a narrow cavity, barely wide enough for a handful of small belongings, each wrapped carefully in age-softed cloth. Louisa reached inside, her fingers brushing what felt like paper edges, smooth metal, and something woven. She lifted the bundle closest to her, its cotton wrap frayed at the corners and tinted a soft sepia from time. When she unfolded it, a small brass key rolled into her palm, its bow shaped like an old teardrop and its teeth uneven, as if hand-filed by someone desperate or determined. Beside the key lay a tiny fabric square, embroidered with a single initial M stitched in deep red thread. The stitching was uneven, almost childlike, carrying a sense of fragile air. The moment Louisa touched the embroidered letter, a soft shift of air brushed past her cheek, warm and fleeting, like a whisper moving too quickly to form words. She held still, letting the silence settle around her, listening for the tapping, the creaking, anything. But the house had hushed again, falling into a silence so complete it felt intentional. Louisa unfolded the rest of the bundle and discovered thin handwritten notes, each folded twice and tied with a thread. The top note's paper was brittle, its edges feathered by time. She opened it with care, revealing a few lines written in the same hurried script she had seen in the attic journal. "If they ever find this, tell them I tried to keep the door closed. I tried to keep it from choosing." The words sent a slow ripple of warmth down Louisa's spine, not fear, but recognition. The door that opened by itself. It wasn't random. It was selective, intentional, alive in its own quiet way. She read the second note. "It only opens for those who carry memories they don't yet understand." Louisa inhaled gently, her breath steady, her heartbeat restful despite the strangeness. This wasn't a threat. It was an invitation, a continuation, a story that had chosen her as its next witness. As she set the notes aside, her fingers grazed the last item in the hidden space, a small wooden toy bird. Its paint was chipped, its wings carved with delicate patterns that suggested it had once been held often and loved deeply. When she lifted it, something shifted deep in the walls, a faint wooden click, small and soft, like the turning of a distant lock. The hallway lights dimmed, then glowed steadier, warmer, as if acknowledging her discovery. Louisa rose slowly, her movements gentle and unhurried, cradling the toy bird and the brass key in her hands. As she stood, the house seemed to exhale, the floor beneath her feet settling in a long, satisfied sigh. When she took a few steps forward, the tapping resumed, not behind her, not beneath her, but ahead, down the hall, deliberate as always. Tap, 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 tap. Louisa moved toward the sound, guided by its soft insistence. The hall stretched before her like a gentle tunnel of amber light. The old wallpaper patterned with faded vines and lilies that seemed to sway subtly in her peripheral vision. The tapping grew quieter as she approached a door she hadn't noticed before, tucked between two built-in bookshelves. Its frame painted a muted ivory that glowed faintly. The brass key warmed in her hand. Louisa reached out, letting her fingers hover over the doorknob. She didn't feel for only that same slow peace that the house seemed to breathe into her, as though every step she took was part of a long overdue reunion. When she finally touched the knob, the door opened with a soft click, not wide, but just enough to welcome her. Inside, warm lamplight glowed across a small room, dust dancing like quiet spirits in the stillness. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old toys, journals, and tiny carved animals. In the center stood a rocking chair, gently swaying, though no one sat in it. Louisa stepped inside, her breath soft, her body heavy with calm, and when the door eased shut behind her, she felt no tension. A sense of being held, watched over, and remembered. The rocking chair stilled at last, as though settling into perfect balance. Louisa whispered into the serene quiet, "I'm listening," and somewhere deep in the walls, the house whispered something back, soft and warm just beyond understanding. The next morning arrived with a muted kind of sunlight, the kind that felt as though it had passed through layers of fog and old memories before touching the earth. Eleanor woke with a stiffness in her shoulders, the kind that came after a night of pretending to sleep while listening for things that shouldn't move, but somehow did. The door, the same door that had creaked open by itself in the quiet hours, remained shut, exactly as she had pushed it closed before dawn. It looked perfectly ordinary in the daylight, almost embarrassed to have caused such unease. She stood and approached it slowly, half expecting it to swing inward again as though acknowledging her return. But it didn't. It stayed still, obedient, wooden, silent. Eleanor placed her hand on the knob for longer than necessary, feeling the faint coolness of metal, the kinds that carried the memory of temperature even in a warm room. There was nothing unusual, no draft, no looseness, no sign of misalignment, and yet something had opened it. Something had wanted it open. She stepped back, exhaling in frustration as much as confusion, then moved to the kitchen window where she could see the narrow street outside framed by sleepy houses, porches sagging under the weight of years, and a thin breeze that seemed to whisper along the wooden siding. Willow Creek always looked peaceful in the morning, but Eleanor sensed an undercurrent, the kind of quiet that wasn't silence but rather something wading beneath the surface. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Marla, her neighbor, who had an uncanny ability to know when something was bothering people. "Saw your light on Lates. Everything okay?" Eleanor hesitated before replying, deciding not to mention the door. Instead, she typed a simple, "couldn't sleep. Coffee later," Marla responded almost instantly. "Already brewing. Come whenever." Eleanor slipped on a sweater, but before she left, she turned again toward the door at the end of the hall. It still hadn't moved, still looked harmless, but she whispered under her breath, "I heard you." Then she stepped outside. Willow Creek greeted her with the sound of rustling leaves and distant crows, the air cool enough to make her breath visible. She walked slowly, studying every porch she passed, every window curtain drawn just a little too tight, every mailbox that had rusted unevenly, as though touched by careless hands. The town had always felt old, but today it felt ancient, as though it carried stories no one would speak. Marla's house, painted a soft blue that had faded gracefully into a gentle gray, sat near the end of the lane. The front door was already open, the smell of fresh coffee drifting out warmly. "There you are," Marla said, waving Eleanor in. "Rough nights." Eleanor sat, wrapping her hands around a warm mug. She wasn't sure how to begin. The door, opening by itself, sounded absurd, like the kind of story told by people who wanted attention or who let shadows think for them. But she trusted Marla. "Something weird happened," Eleanor said finally. "Weird? How?" "A door in my house. The one at the end of the hallway. It opened by itself last night." Marla stopped, stirring her tea. Her expression didn't shift into disbelief, nor humor, just a slow, thoughtful stillness. "Did you check the hinges?" "Yes." "Any animals?" "Drafts." "Nothing." "Nothing." Marla set her spoon down gently, as though careful not to disturb a delicate balance in the air. "Has it happened before?" "No. At least, not that I remember." Marla's eyes flickered subtly. There it was again, that strange undercurrent Eleanor had always sensed, but never questioned. "You know," Marla said softly, "doors in this town, they don't always stay closed." Eleanor blinked, unsure whether it was a joke or a warning, but Marla's voice was calm, almost tender. "What do you mean?" Marla leaned back, looking toward the window where the street shimmered faintly under the pale light. "Old towns have long memories," she said, "and sometimes they opened things we've forgotten." A shiver moved through Eleanor, not from fear but from recognition, like something inside her had been waiting to hear those words. "Marla," she whispered, "are you saying this has happened before to other people?" Marla didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for her tea, blew lightly across the surface, and finally said, "I think it's time you learned what Willow Creek remembers." Marla's words lingered in the quiet kitchen like a draft that had slipped in through unseen cracks, subtle yet undeniable. Eleanor leaned forward, her fingers tightening around the warm ceramic mug, as though anchoring herself. "What does Willow Creek remember?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. Marla didn't answer at first. She stood, walked to a drawer near the sink, and pulled out an old tin box, small, scratched and dented, as though it had lived through many owners. She placed it on the table between them. "Open it," she said softly. Eleanor hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside were photographs, old ones, the kind printed on thick paper with browned edges that curled like dried leaves. She picked up the first photo, a hallway that looked unsettlingly familiar. Narrow, wooden floor, a single door at the far end. Her heartbeat quickened. It was almost identical to her hallway. "This," she whispered. "This can't be my house." "It isn't," Marla said. "That photo was taken almost 50 years ago. The house belonged to the Whitmore family. They lived on your street, just 2 doors down from where you are now." Eleanor studied the image. The hallway was empty, but something about the shadows near the door made her skin prickle. "Why do you have this?" Marla exhaled slowly, like someone preparing to peel back the layer of a very old story. "Because strange things started happening in that house. Little things at first. Chairs moved a few inches overnight. A window that refused to stay locked. And then," she pointed to the photo, "that door, the one in the picture. The Whitmores complained it opened by itself, night after night, no matter how they secured it." Eleanor felt her pulse climb. What was behind it? "Just a storage room," Marla replied. "Nothing special. No crawl space, no basement access, no old family secrets locked inside." And yet, it kept opening. Eleanor placed the photo down carefully, afraid it might crumble. "Did anything happen to them?" Marla looked at her with a gentle seriousness. "They left one night without telling anyone. They packed their things into a truck and drove away before sunrise. They never came back. The house was sold, remodeled, and eventually torn down." Eleanor frowned. "But what does that have to do with my house?" Marla reached into the box again and pulled out another photograph. This one made Eleanor's breath catch. It was an older picture, maybe 80 or 90 years old, sepia-toned and faded. It showed another hallway, different house, same kind of door. Same position. Position, same eerie stillness. "This door," Marla said, tapping the photo, "was from the Baxter home, a farmhouse that used to stand near the creek. It also opened on its own." Eleanor stared at her. "Are you saying this is some kind of pattern?" "I'm saying," Marla replied, "that Willow Creek has always had doors that open when they shouldn't. Doors that lead to nothing unusual, yet behave as though they're responding to something or someone you can't see." A chill wrapped around Eleanor's spine. "Why?" Marla shook her head. "No one knows. People have theories. Of course, some think the town sits on shifting ground that affects hinges. Others talk about pressure changes or old construction. But most locals, they believe the town remembers. And sometimes doors open because something wants to be acknowledged." Eleanor swallowed hard. "Are there stories about what happens if someone ignores the doors?" Marla hesitated, then answered quietly. "People who ignored them often felt watched, heard footsteps in empty rooms, saw shadows where shadows shouldn't be. Small things that wore them down. Not dangerous, just persistent. Like a reminder. Eleanor looked at her hands. A reminder of what? Marla gave her a long, unreadable glance. That this town is old. Older than any of us. And old places. They don't like being forgotten. The words sank into Eleanor slowly, like ink spreading across paper. Suddenly, she thought of the door in her hallway, the slow, deliberate creak, the quiet insistence. So what do I do? Say, ask it. What am I supposed to do if it opens again? Marla leaned closer, her eyes warm but edged with something solemn. If it opens again, don't ignore it. Don't run. Don't slam it shut in fear. Just stand there. Listen. Then gently close it again. Astaugiu retelling whoever or whatever is behind it that you've heard them. Eleanor's breath trembled. And if something is actually there? Marla placed a reassuring hand over hers. Then it's only trying to remember you, too. Something about that answer strange, poetic, unsettling rooted itself deep inside Eleanor. She didn't know whether it comforted her or terrified her, but she knew one thing for certain. When she returned home, she would look at that door differently. Not as an intruder, not as a threat, but as part of Willow Creek's long, whispering memory. Come back later, Marla said softly. I'll tell you more. Eleanor nodded, unsure whether she wanted to know more, yet equally afraid not to. And outside, the pale morning light drifted across Willow Creek as though sliding over the pages of a story still being written, one in which her name had just been added asterisk. Eleanor stepped out of Marla's house with the tin box still lingering in her thoughts, its photographs etched in her mind like fingerprints pressed into soft clay. The air outside had grown cooler, carrying the faint scent of pine and the metallic hush of an approaching storm. Willow Creek always felt quiet, but today its silence seemed to lean toward her. Attentive, almost expectant, she walked the short path back to her house, gravel shifting under her footsteps, each stone crunching like a whispered warning. The sun had dipped behind a veil of clouds, and the light that filtered through felt pale and thin, as if the day itself had grown cautious. When Eleanor reached her porch, she paused. Something felt slightly off. The wind chime above the railing, which usually rang softly with every breeze, hung motionless despite the rustling branches nearby. The air around her doorway felt still, dense, as though time hesitated here. She unlocked the door slowly and stepped inside. The house greeted her with its familiar hush, but it wasn't the same hush as before. This one had weight. The kind of quiet that listens back. Eleanor's heartbeat thudded in her ears as she set her keys down. Her eyes drifted to the hallway, the narrow corridor stretching toward the back room where the mystery began. The door at the end was closed. Perfectly closed. Exactly how she had left it. Yet something inside her tightened. With slow steps she approached the hallway, her feet sinking into the worn rug. As she neared the door, the floorboard beneath her let out a low, drawn-out creak. She froze. The house seemed to breathe around her. She extended a cautious hand toward the doorknob, remembering Marla's advice. Stand there. Listen. Don't show fear. But before her fingers reached the metal, a soft thump came from behind the door. Not loud, Not violent, just a quiet, unmistakable sound as though someone inside had shifted their weight or placed something gently on the floor. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She withdrew her hands slightly. "I hear you," she whispered, unsure why the words came out, but feeling compelled by something older than fear, something instinctive. The house responded with silence. Then another thump, softer than the first, like a whisper made physical. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself not to step back. "I'm listening," she said again, this time more firmly. The stillness that followed felt deeper, like the house was considering her words. Then, very slowly, the doorknob twitched, a small, almost timid movement, as though someone on the other side had brushed their fingers against it. Eleanor's breath trembled, but she stood her ground. The knob didn't turn again. The silence stretched, filling the hallway with tension, then dissolved into a familiar, gentle creaking sound. The door opened just a few inches, softly, almost apologetically. Eleanor swallowed, remembering Marla's instructions. She didn't run. She didn't slam it shut. Instead, she stepped closer, her movements steady, controlled. She placed her fingertips against the edge of the door and pushed it open just enough to look inside. The spare room was exactly as always. An empty wooden floor, a small dresser, a window partly fogged by the cold. Nothing moved. No shadows shifted. No presence lurked. And yet, Eleanor felt it. A faint pressure, like someone standing near her shoulder, watching her quietly. Not threatening. Not demanding. Just observing. "I'm here," she whispered into the stillness. For a moment, the air in the room seemed too warm, as though acknowledging her presence. She exhaled slowly and gently closed the door, pressing it back into the frame until it rested against the latch without clicking fully shut. The moment it closed, a cool breeze drifted down the hallway. Impossible, every window was shut. Still, the breeze brushed past her, lifting a few loose strands of her hair. It felt like an unseen figure passing, moving away from the door, drifting toward the living room. Eleanor turned, following the shift in the air. The breeze vanished by the time she reached the living room, replaced by stillness. But the room felt different, lighter, perhaps, or maybe she was imagining it. She walked to the fireplace and sat down on the old armchair, curling her fingers around its frayed fabric. Her breathing slowed, her heartbeat softened. She felt calmer than she expected, almost as if the house had wanted her attention, and now that it had been acknowledged, it had settled. Eleanor closed her eyes and leaned back, exhaustion washing over her. She didn't drift into sleep, but into a quiet in-between, where the world softened into muted edges, and within that drifting silence, a sound emerged. A whisper, not words. Who's the soft rhythmic sound of footsteps moving slowly across the hallway, back and forth, as though someone was keeping watch, as though someone had always kept watch. And Eleanor, despite everything, didn't feel afraid anymore. The footsteps continued their slow, measured pacing long after the last trace of twilight faded behind the hills. Eleanor remained in the old armchair, her body sinking deeper into the worn cushions, as though the chair itself wished to cradle her through the unsettling stillness. The soft rhythm of movement down the hall no longer felt like an intrusion, but instead like a quiet presence. Steady, almost protective. The house seemed to hum with a low, muted breath, as though it too had settled into a fragile peace. After several long minutes, the footsteps stopped, not abruptly, not startlingly. They simply faded, the way wind disappears from the treetops when the night grows heavy. Eleanor lifted her head slightly, listening. Nothing. Just the hush of Willow Creek after dark. A hush so deep, it felt like the world had been wrapped in cotton. She rose slowly from the chair and moved toward the hallway once more. Her feet made almost no sound as she walked, as though the house itself softer. Her steps, when she reached the spare room door, she found it closed again, fully closed. Closed? She didn't remember shutting it. A strange calm washed over her instead of fear. She placed her palm flat against the door, feeling the faint coolness of the wood. "I know you're here," she whispered, not expecting a response, but feeling the need to say it. The air behind the door shifted, not to sound more, like the gentlest pressure of awareness. A presence leaning closer. Curious. Listening. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in deeply the faint scent of cedar and something older, like aged paper or distant rain. "If you're trying to tell me something," she murmured, "I'm willing to hear it." Nothing stirred, yet the house no longer felt hostile. Instead, a faint warmth touched her skin, like the soft glow of a lantern carried from far down a forgotten road. She lowered her hand and stepped back, letting silence drape over the moment, like a delicate veil. Then a sudden draft whispered through the hallway, cool, purposeful, moving past her shoulder and down toward the living room again. It brushed against her like a gentle tug, an invitation. Eleanor followed. The living room had darkened since she'd left it. Only the faintest silver-blue light filtered in from the window, where the moon now hung low behind drifting clouds. The breeze moved with intention, gliding across the room and toward the old bookshelf, standing against the far wall. Eleanor hesitated only a second before walking toward it. The shelf was filled with dusty volumes, left by the house's previous owner, a quiet widow named Harriet Bell, who had passed away 10 years earlier. Eleanor had never felt compelled to explore them, but as she approached, one book seemed displaced, a thin, weathered journal lying sideways atop other books, its spine cracked, its cover pale from age. She didn't remember seeing it before. Her fingertips tingled as she reached out and lifted the journal, the air around her thickening with the scent of brittle paper and ink that had long since faded. She held it gently, almost reverently, and opened to the first page. There, written in a delicate, looping script, was a name, Harriet Bell. And below it, a single line that made Eleanor's breath catch. If the door opens again, it means he has returned. A chill swept through her chest. Not sharp, but deep and spreading, like cool water seeping into stone. She turned the page slowly, and the journal revealed entries describing Harriet's life's simple routines, lonely evenings, quiet reflections on the changing seasons. Then, several pages in, the tone shifted. Harriet wrote of a presence in the house, a soft, wandering spirit who opened the spare room door only when seeking comfort or connection. She called him the boy in the hallway. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she read on, the handwriting growing shaky. He never means harm. He only walks when he is afraid, when the nights feel too long. I hear him trying to open the door sometimes, but it's not for me not anymore. He waits for someone who listens. Eleanor closed the journal slowly, her fingers trembling. The boy in the hallway. Her mind replayed every small sound she had heard since moving in. The soft knocks, the hesitant footsteps, the quiet creak of the doorknob, and that gentle searching presence. A shiver rippled up her spine, but not out of terror. Something like empathy blossomed under her ribs. "You've been here a long time," she whispered to the empty room. The air warmed so subtly. She wondered if she imagined it. She clutched the journal to her chest and walked back toward the hallway. The house remained still, listening, waiting. As she reached the spare room door once more, she paused, her voice lowered, gentle as breath. "I'm here now." And somewhere behind the wood so faint she couldn't be certain, came the softest reply, a single, fragile tap, like a child acknowledging her presence. Eleanor stood frozen in front of the spare room door, her hand hovering just above the old brass knob, the soft tap from the other side still echoing inside her chest, like a memory she had never lived, yet somehow understood. The house had fallen silent again, but it was no longer the cold, indifferent silence of an empty building. It felt expectant, alive, like the walls themselves were holding their breath with her. She swallowed gently and whispered, "It's all right. You can show me." The hallway lights flickered once, dimming to a low amber glow, as if the electricity itself shifted to accommodate the moment. Eleanor turned the journal over in her hand, the edges of its pages brushing against her fingertips like a reassurance she did not know she needed. Harriet Bell had written about the boy in the hallway with a tenderness that made Eleanor's heart ache. And now, standing here, she felt that same tender pull, a quiet thread, drawing her closer to a presence she could not see but could feel as clearly as her own pulse. She pressed lightly on the door, and this time it opened without resistance, swinging inward on its creaking hinges with a slow and gentle grace, as though someone on the other side had helped guide it. The room was still empty, the same faint scent of cedar, the same pale moonlight spilling across the wooden floorboards. Yet the air felt different, warmer, softer, carrying the impression of someone having just stepped out of sight. Eleanor entered the room slowly, each step measured and quiet. "You don't have to hide," she whispered into the dim air. "I'm here." A faint rustle stirred near the far corner, where a small wooden chest sat beneath the window. The chest had always been there, left behind by Harriet Bell, but Eleanor had never opened it. She approached it cautiously, lowering herself to her knees as she set the journal aside. The lid was slightly ajar, as if nudged open by invisible hands. She hesitated only a moment before lifting it. Inside lay a small collection of belongings: a folded wool blanket, a tin soldier missing one arm, a pair of scuffed children's shoes far too old and worn to belong to any recent memory. Eleanor's breath hitched softly. She traced her fingers along the surface of the shoes, feeling the faded impressions of tiny steps, long since stilled. Then, at the bottom of the chest, she found a photograph, A boy of about 7 stared back at her from the sepia-toned image, his hair neatly combed, his expression shy but warm, as though he had tried to smile for the camera, but only managed a timid curve of the lips. On the back, written in Harriet Bell's familiar looping handwriting, were 4 words. He never grew up. A wave of tenderness mixed with sorrow washed through Eleanor, settling deep behind her ribs. The house wasn't haunted in the way people feared. It was holding a memory, a child who had stayed behind, lost between longing and silence. A soft thump echoed behind her, not loud, not startling. She turned slowly. The door to the room had closed again. But this time, Eleanor didn't feel trapped. Instead, a gentle warmth filled the space, as if the air itself drew closer. She rose to her feet, her voice dropping to a soft murmur. "You're the boy Harriet wrote about, aren't you?" The shadows at the edge of the room shifted, subtle as a breath. Eleanor's eyes softened. "Were you waiting for her all this time?" A faint creak sounded in the floorboards, traveling from the corner toward her in slow, hesitant steps. Each creak was spaced apart, as though small feet moved cautiously across the room, unsure if they were welcome. "It's okay," she whispered, barely louder than the quiet night. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." The room exhaled gently, a whisper of air brushing her cheek like the soft stroke of a child seeking comfort. She felt her heart clench with empathy. Someone had to stay. Someone had to listen. She reached for the journal again, holding it to her chest. "Would you like me to read to you?" The air warmed instantly, like a small burst of gratitude. Eleanor sat down on the floor beside the wooden chest, leaning her back against the pale wall as she opened the journal to its first page. She began to read Harriet's gentle words aloud, her voice slow and steady, each sentence drifting softly into the room like a lullaby. And as she read, she heard a faint shifting of weight beside her, the soft, nearly imperceptible sound of a child settling down to listen. Not seen, but unmistakably there. A presence no longer wandering the hallway alone. A presence finding, for the first time in decades, a voice reading him gently into the night. Eleanor read aloud until her voice softened into a warm, rhythmic hush, each word floating gently through the room like dust caught in moonlight. The journal rested open across her palms, and as she turned another fragile page, she noticed the air shift again, the slightest dip in temperature at her side, not chilling, but tender, as if someone small had leaned close enough to rest their head lightly against her arm. She didn't look. She didn't need to. Presence could be felt more clearly when you weren't straining to see it. The story moved through quiet memories. Harriet had written the boy's laughter, the way he used to run down the hall on Saturday mornings, the accident no one wanted to speak about, and the silence that wrapped itself around the house after he was gone. A silence so deep it left its own kind of echo. Eleanor kept reading, her voice dipping lower with each paragraph, until her own breath synced with the slow, steady pace of the house's breathing. Somewhere far off, a clock ticked in its steady, old-fashioned rhythm, marking the passing of time that the boy had never been allowed to grow into. When she paused to wet her lips, the room seemed to lean forward, urging her to continue. She smiled softly. "All right," she whispered, "one more page." As she read, a faint glow began to form near the far corner of the room, a soft bluish shimmer, like moonlight collecting into shape. Eleanor noticed it only in the way the shadows shifted slightly across the floorboards. But she did not stop. Her voice remained steady, gentle, smooth, guiding the air like a lullaby, shaping itself into something peaceful. Then, as she reached the end of the page, she felt it. The delicate brush of small fingers grazing the back of her hand. A child's touch. Light as breath, cold, but not unkind. She exhaled slowly, her voice barely a murmur. "I'm here." The glowing shape in the corner pulsed faintly, gathering clarity like fog drawing together into a soft outline. The form was small, maybe 3 feet high, slender, still. The boy, he didn't step forward. Instead, the air around him shimmered with the quiet ache of someone who had been waiting too long to be remembered. Eleanor closed the journal gently and placed it on her lap. "You don't need to stay here anymore," she whispered. "Harriet, she's not coming back, but I can help you rest." The glow flickered, as though confusion rippled through its center. Eleanor nodded softly, as if speaking to a frightened child whose questions she could hear without sound. "You've carried this house on your shoulders for too long. You've kept the door open. You've waited in the hall. You've tried to be seen. But you don't need to hold the memory all by yourself anymore." The room seemed to sigh, the walls settling, the floor humming faintly. A warm wind impossible for a closed room stirred her hair as though brushing away decades of dust from the boy's burden. She extended her hands slowly toward the faint glow. "You're safe," she murmured, "and you're not alone now." The glow brightened for a moment, then dimmed, then brightened again like a child trying to decide whether to take a step into someone's arms. Eleanor stayed still, offering nothing but presence and patience. And then he moved. Small footsteps on the wooden floor whispered toward her, not loud, not sharp, just the gentle patter of a child crossing a familiar room. When he came close enough, the glow lowered, as if he were resting his forehead against the side of her arm. Eleanor let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "It's all right," she whispered. "You can rest now." The glow around the boy shimmered and began to unravel like thin threads of moonlight being pulled gently back into the night. The pressure at Eleanor's arm faded. The cold lifted. The presence loosened into the air, dissolving into peace. And then he was gone, not vanished in fear, not ripped away by some unseen force, gone gently, like a final exhale. Ah, release. The house shifted around her, its old bones relaxing, the hallway losing its tension for the first time in decades. Eleanor rose slowly, closing the journal and placing it on the wooden chest with a kind of reverence. "Thank you for trusting me," she whispered into the quiet room. The door behind her eased open on its own. A haunting gesture now, but a simple farewell. Eleanor stepped out into the hallway, and the house felt different beneath her feet. Lighter, warmer, like a long-held weight had been set down at last. Before turning off the lights, she looked back into the spare room, the room that had waited for a child who never grew up. Moonlight washed over the floor in soft silver patterns. For the first time, The space felt empty in a way that wasn't lonely. It felt peaceful, rested, complete. As she walked toward her bedroom, Eleanor whispered the closing words she knew the listeners of Midnight Murmurs Radio needed to hear, just as much as the little boy once had. As the story fades, allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep.